Well, today I am very, very grateful to have Shawna here from the Oregon Family Support Network. My name is Christina. I'm one of the co-directors of the Northwest MHTTC. And we're here to talk about navigating the tough stuff, LGBTQ suicide awareness for families. And so we're very happy to have you here. We want to start first with our land acknowledgement. And we just, in this virtual world, it's not the same as when it used to be, but we are based in Seattle, and the University of Washington certainly acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We always want to honor their heritage and work for justice. If you haven't heard of the Native Land website, it's really nice to learn about the stewards of your land. And so encourage you to check that out. So a little bit about our network. If you haven't been part of our events before or across the MHTTC, we started in late 2018. We are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. We have 10 regional centers. We have a National American Indian Alaska Native Center, and a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. You may have heard of the Addiction Technology Transfer Centers, ATTCs. They've been around for about 30 years. And then there's a prevention one that started around the same time. So we support resource development, workforce development, training, and TA. And we are in Region 10. So we're happy to work with Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. But many of you probably are from somewhere else, because everyone can join from Zoom almost anywhere if you have internet. So we are based in the University of Washington. And our goals are the same as a network: to accelerate adoption of EBPs, evidence-based practices, and other practices, heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, foster alliances in our communities, and ensure free training and TA like today. And so we do that through webinars. We have learning communities. We have online courses that are all free. Everything we do is free. We have newsletters and tip sheets and all of that. And so really who we're looking to train is anyone who has, interface with mental health of folks that they're serving, which is probably a lot of us these days. So we're excited to see you. And if you want to sign up for our newsletter, we'll show you how to do that later. We have an area of focus of evidence-based practices for serious mental illness for our network, but that's not the only thing we train on. And we certainly don't think that's the only thing that's important to share, but it is a specialty of our faculty in the center. So at the MHTTC network, we actually created this slide based on some other work to use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language. We know this is an evolving, catalog of things, and we keep learning and how to use words that promote recovery and are respectful, non-judgmental. So we just encourage everyone to just keep that in mind as you're communicating via chat and everything in that way. We also want to review some logistics. So quickly, you're muted, you're off camera, and this is being recorded, which you already, I think, know. We do have closed captioning available. So I think that has been put down. I cannot see it if it is, but hopefully that's available to you, and you can close it out if you do not want that. If not, please ask us and we will turn that on. We will send the video and slides and a way to get a certificate of attendance in a couple of weeks. For chat, please use that for talking amongst yourselves. If you just want to make a comment or say hi, where you're from. Tech issue we can try to help you with. Gabrielle is our wonderful staff in the background helping right now. But Q&A, so Shawna is going to try to answer as many questions as she can at the end. And so we need you to put it in the Q&A part, because I can't copy and paste it into there from the chat. I don't know why, but please know that we really value your questions. You can throw those in at any time. It won't interrupt us. I will wait and hold on those until we get to the end. So there we go. And if we don't get to your question, we will try to ask Shawna later. We try to summarize like key points of these kind of webinars. And so we can ask her to answer later. Did want to say, because I know, Shawna, you brought this up before, that like often, these are personal issues for many of us. And if you do have a specific question about a specific client, participant, consumer or a family member, we can't really answer those kind of specific kind of questions, but we can certainly refer you to some resources and all of that. But this is meant to be more of a kind of a general learning experience. But we know that this is personal for many of us. So thank you for your appreciation. We are funded by SAMHSA. They do not know exactly what we're going to say here today. So that's just a little disclaimer. Also want to say, if you have taken our events before, you've taken this survey. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out. We really look at the information. We love seeing your feedback. The survey has changed as of a week ago today. So I just want to warn you, it always asked you for a couple of letters and a couple of numbers for your personal code. It is now 12 digits long and seems possibly more personal than before. We didn't make this up. The government chose it. It's what we have to work with. Please know that just pick whatever letters and numbers you want to choose today. It doesn't matter to us. It doesn't hurt anything if you make things up. We just want you to feel comfortable and to give us your feedback. That's the important part. So we can't track anything, but we know it might seem a little awkward. All right. I think I have missed about 35 things in the chat. Hopefully there's nothing major happening that I need to attend to, like my microphone isn't working. But let's go ahead and share the results of the poll of who's in the room. So thank you so much for like 90% of you. Excellent. Okay. Awesome. That's really great to see who's here. What a wide variety. So that's fantastic. Well, I'm going to close that out. And then thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then we're going to have a little conversation. So I am so pleased to, we've worked with Oregon Family Support Network for a while now, and I know their executive director is on our advisory board. So we're really a big fan of what they do. Shawna Canaga, I'm sure I'm not saying your name right. I apologize. I should have asked that before, is a family support specialist and the statewide peer delivered services trainer for OFSN. It is a family-run organization that promotes behavioral, mental, and emotional wellness for families and youth through education, support, and advocacy. Shawna comes to this position with over a decade of experience supporting youth and families. And I think I'll save the rest for later because we're going to talk about how you came to this work. But through all these journeys, being a mother, being a professional, really, it's obvious you have a passion for this family-driven and person-centered care and family-serving system. So thank you so much for that. Do you want to say a quick hi before we get into our little chat?
Yeah, just hello, everybody. I am super excited to be here with you today and partnering with MHTTC again this summer. As Christina said, we've been working with them for a few years now, and I think we're going to have a wonderful session. And I'm just excited. And hello, I've been monitoring chat, and hi to all my Oregon peeps. I'm coming from Oregon too, so yeah, just want to give a shout out to my Oregon friends down here.
Perfect, thank you. So Shawna, let me start by saying, Shawna, that I know these issues are so crucial right now for people to learn about and be more aware that, the issue of and topic of, suicide awareness in general, youth suicide awareness, LGBTQ youth suicide awareness. This is really important and crisis level things. We know we are facing unprecedented times and crises in children's and youth and young adult mental health. I really appreciate this topic and the title that you have for your content here, which is Navigating the Tough Stuff. I'm wondering, why did you choose that phrase? You're such a good trainer. You're such an experienced person. Tell me why you described it that way.
Very interesting. Well, first I want to say, okay, great. I wasn't sure if you wanted that stuff up on the screen.
Oh, no, I think something is not going right. That's strange. Sorry about that. Yeah, so stop sharing. There we go.
A few years back, I had somebody come into my office and they approached me with this new curriculum request. And one of the things they said is, hey, we really want to talk to families about suicide awareness and prevention and intervention, but in a way that really speaks to that family-friendly language and really speaks to the heart of the fears and the concerns and the joys and the hopes and the needs of families that wasn't super clinical. So I kind of brainstormed a little bit and I was like, suicide it's tough stuff to talk about. And sometimes it's just so nice where families can get together around like a round table, like a support group style, and just navigate that tough stuff together. And so the name was born, Navigating the Tough Stuff, Suicide Awareness for Families. And what's really interesting with this one is this is a multi-part curriculum, but we have segmented. We've got, navigating the tough stuff with rural and frontier families, navigating the tough stuff with, communities of color, navigating the tough stuff with LGBTQ, and navigating the tough stuff with our Spanish-speaking communities. So we're really trying to make it as broad as possible because we know our families are broad and wonderful and have many needs.
That's great. I mean, it's the tough stuff happens. We wish it didn't happen, but navigating through, learning how to get through that journey, and that it's not, one time, a thing that you're affected, for a long time when these things are happening. You mentioned in your bio, you're a mother, you have a lot of personal investment in doing this work, as a lot of us do. Can you talk about how you came to work in the field and how you got into this position, and what does it mean for you to do this kind of work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess I can kind of put that into three segments. I spent about 10 years at Oregon State University, or in college for about 10 years, and finished up at Oregon State University. And I just have a passion for learning. But throughout my educational journey, my daughter, who has given me consent to speak about her today, I have an adult child who lives with mental health and behavioral health challenges, which emerged about when she was 12, about puberty, which was pretty atypical. And throughout that journey, I just became really, really passionate about working with youth, families, disconnected community members, disenfranchised community members. And it has started my 16-year journey now of working with youth and families.
Wow. Thank you. I mean, I think it's so common that we come to these fields, maybe not even knowing how our own personal journey, affected our career choice. And for many, it feels very in sync with what we do in our lives. And so I really appreciate the passion that you bring, and, all the learning and heartache, all the lessons you've learned by being a mother as well, not just being, someone who read a book about it.
Yeah.
I know it's really, it means a lot, I think, with parents feeling supported. So that's why I love what your organization does so much. What issues, if we can think about it, we're talking about a lot of specific things here, but, in this context, are there other, racial health or other inequities that come to mind when you are thinking about, why this topic specifically? I guess I might ask, why LGBTQ youth suicide today? Is that something that you wanted to focus on?
Especially in my community, this is a big topic right now. One where many groups are very divided, and many groups are very, I don't know exactly the word I want to use, but many groups are very divided about it. And one of the things in my community I really want to speak to is that at the end of the day, this is a family issue, right? These are our youth, these are our children, these are our community members, these are our adults, and making sure that we have equitable care, equitable communication, equitable access, equitable services is really important to me from a community level. But beyond that, for me, it's very personal. As I told you, I am the parent of an adult child who lives with mental health and behavioral health challenges, but my daughter is also part of the LGBTQ community. And she also, and again, with consent, has let me share this. My daughter lives with chronic suicidality, which is vastly different than acute suicidality. So for her life, about the last 18 years, has been really navigating as an LGBTQ person and somebody who is chronically suicidal, navigating how the economic systems, the healthcare systems, the mental health care systems are not as accessible or as knowledgeable about her particular needs and her particular situation. So, and that's mental health in general, right? But then you throw in LGBTQ and then, a few other factors. So it's very personable. It's very personal to me. Yeah. So that's why.
Yeah, that's such a good point around folks that have an acute issue versus a chronic sort of experience. And, we'll make sure, folks have a number of resources that you have shared and we have also seen and done in our center. I think I might know the answer to this, but last question is, what inspires you to keep doing this work? I know it's personal. I know it's got to be exhausting. And I know the lines between work and home and all these emotions must be very challenging, but it's so inspirational. How do you keep it up? Maybe that's a much longer question than it's
a lot of rock star. No, again, it's just personal. I keep it up because I've seen the pathways to hope and healing. I've seen care. I've seen joy. I've seen lives continue day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Both my daughter and I never thought she'd make it to 30, and as a queer person, she faced immense challenges. And so it just keeps me going. And, I've said to a few people also, we're navigating some possibility of some of my other family members, really kind of looking at their own gender identity and at 7, 8, 9, 10 years old and really wanting to be a part of health, wellness, healing, and hope for this generation, the next generation, and the generations to come, so that we can talk about suicide, so we can break the stigma, and so that we can start creating systems that serve all of us to the best of their ability.
Wow. Well, thank you. This has been, insightful. I'm so grateful for what you're doing to help families and providers and anyone who's here. You touched on a couple of things that I just wanted to say in our kind of wrapping this discussion up is, stigma and access and, that I've heard so many different communities actually talk about, let's not just talk about our deficits or the things that have risk factors, so I know that's important. At the same time, these are lives that do have additional risk because of our society, right? And so there's inherent strengths, beauties, and all of that. And at the same time, we want to be mindful of, so I know, just so grateful for your time today. And thank you so much for what you do. Okay, so at this point, I will let you take it away with your presentation. I'm going to not share my Teams stuff. Sorry about that. And I'll go off video. And please throw your questions into the Q&A and we'll let you take it away, Shawna. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me be sure. Is the screen up here for y'all?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Well, we are going to get rocking and rolling, talking about navigating the tough stuff, suicide awareness for families raising LGBTQ youth, young adults, and kind of, I think maybe somewhere between generally, kind of that 10 to 30 year range. As I said, this was a curriculum that we were asked for here in Oregon. And it is a multi-tiered curriculum. So the first one is really just around opening up that conversation with parents, caregivers, and forever people about how do we talk about suicide awareness? How do we talk about suicide? How do we understand risk factors? Where do we get this expert information? And how do we, kind of push back on some of those stigma and myths? And so this is going to be very lecture heavy. And to be honest, it's probably going to go very swiftly. This class was designed as really kind of a 2-3 hour just gathering of parents and caregivers to have some time for dialogue and transparency and organic conversations. So for this particular session here with MHTTC, we might go pretty swiftly, but we'll try to leave some time for Q&A. The second module is around navigating the tough stuff, suicide prevention for families raising LGBTQ youth. And that's really going to focus on, okay, we know that these are the risks. We know that these are some of the challenges. Now, what can we do about it? How do we build those family protective factors, those youth protective factors to help us be more resilient and more balanced and really be able to, as a family, work towards family, hope, health, and healing for all of us, including our LGBTQ youth, right? So what we'll be looking at today is, again, really suicide awareness from the family perspective, the caregiver, the forever person perspective, and I will bring that perspective as a parent of an LGBTQ young adult who lives with chronic suicidality. As I said, we're going to look at some general risk factors and then some specific risk factors to the community. We're going to tackle some of those myths, right? Some of those myths we still hear. You know, we're so far into mental health and behavioral health and suicide work, but it seems like some of those myths and stigma is still pretty prevalent. And then we're going to talk about communication. Not only just communication within the family, because we know talking about suicide is a top protective factor for suicide prevention. But we're also going to be looking at how are our young people talking about suicide? What are some of the different ways? Could that be cultural? And how could we maybe perceive it differently sometimes from our adult culture lens, right? And then we're going to talk about why suicide awareness is a whole family, holistic whole family issue for all of us, okay? So we've already done the who's in the room, so I'm just going to go right past that. But the first thing I want to do before we dive into some curriculum is really just acknowledge something at the get-go. I want us to set the foundation, the lens, and really meditate on how being a part of the LGBTQ plus community in and of itself does not make a young person at higher risk for suicide. Right? It is who they are. It is their core. It is their being. It is the discrimination. It is the fear, the harassment, the rejection that might be coming from communities or culture or society or systems, right? That increase that risk because of the unsupportive and unaccessible environments, right? So I really just want to set that foundation that it's not about being a part of the LGBTQ plus community. It is about the challenges, the barriers that they are facing, right? That can really enhance the risk of being suicidal, having suicide attempts, or dying by suicide. So let's talk a little bit about parents. Parents, right? Because this is, you know, suicide awareness for families. One of the things that I found really interesting in doing some research and data, and for those of you who might know me in this space, I'm a big research and data nerd. I would live my life in college and research if I could. And I really wanted to kind of dive into what do parents think is a overarching health concern for youth and their children, right? And children in their community. So I want to take a look at a few areas. So this, sorry, I've got a screen thing here going on. Want to take a look at some research that was done. And it really looked at what are the top health concerns of parents in the United States, right? So this was done by the Mott's Children's Hospital. It's a national poll that they do generally every year to every few years, right? So if you look at 2014 and 2015, the top three really kind of remained the same: obesity, bullying, drug abuse, right? Health, okay? And then we see some school violence making appearances, sexting, child abuse and neglect, etc. When we start looking now at 2016, bullying, obesity, and drug abuse were the top three once again, right? Now we're starting to see stuff like internet safety, you know, the web is exploding, child abuse and neglect is still there. But what is really interesting in 2016 is suicide made an appearance as number 9, right? Suicide finally made an appearance as the number 9 concern. When we look at 2017, bullying is still really high, internet safety is really high, that stress, school violence is creeping up the ladder. But once again, suicide wasn't really kind of in the forefront of parents' ideas of health concerns, right? And then finally, I want you to see 2020 and then really just kind of meditate on what was going on in 2020, right? So now we're looking at social media being a top concern. Bullying is a top concern. Again, internet's a top concern. But really interesting, depression and suicide made the top 5. Depression and suicide made the top 5 when 2020 hit, okay? So we won't have time to really have a discussion about this as we would if we were in person, as kind of a group together. But I really hope you take a moment to just really meditate. What were some of the similarities that you saw? What were some of the differences? Is there anything that surprised you? Was anyone surprised that suicide didn't really show up until 2016? Was anybody surprised that it crept up in 2020, right? What didn't surprise you? Because I'll tell you, for me, what didn't surprise me was that it showed up a lot higher in 2020, especially with the pandemic and children losing, their school connections and their childcare connections and their daycare connections and their social connections and really that increase of isolation, right? So I just really want you to meditate on what is a health concern for parents and caregivers, and did any of those things really touch your heart at all or strike you, have any epiphanies? Because what we're going to talk about today until probably about 11:45 is why it is a health concern. Suicide is an absolute national and local health concern for all of us, right? For all of us. And we're going to talk specifically really quickly about some reasons why that is, especially within our LGBTQ communities, right? And just for language reference, I tend to say LGBTQI2S, right? And that's, including our queer, questioning, intersex, two-spirit folks. But for this particular webinar, we'll be using the LGBTQ+. So I want you to look at some really startling, at least it's startling to me, things that are happening within our young people in the LGBTQ community. When you look at anxiety, that increased anxiety, right? It is almost 75%, it's almost 3/4 of our LGBTQ youth are reporting anxiety disorders, and 3 and 4 are talking about it and reporting anxiety disorders if they are transgender or are non-binary. Over half of our LGBTQ youth are having major depressive disorders, and more than 2 and 3 or 2 out of 3 of our transgender and non-binary youth are experiencing major depressive disorders. This is concerning. This is so concerning. When we are looking at what we call non-suicidal self-injury, or some of you might have heard the term self-harm, right? Almost half of our LGBTQ youth reported engaging in non-suicidal self-injury in the last year, right? Including over about 60% of our transgender and non-binary youth. And we know that non-suicidal self-injury is that coping mechanism, right? That maladaptive coping mechanism. It is an expression of hurt and pain. We can look at 46% of LGBTQ youth report that they wanted psychological or emotional counseling from a mental health provider, but they couldn't receive it. In a whole year, they couldn't receive it. And for those of you, I saw who's in the room, many, probably the majority of you here are here in a mental health, behavioral health provider capacity in one way or another. And we all know that just mental health and behavioral health access to supports and services in general is really, really tough in our nation right now. I know it is here in Oregon. But then if we throw on top of that the barrier of LGBTQ specific, support services, health and healing, right? Where we find our healers, that is even harder, right? 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth reported that they've been physically threatened or harmed during their lifetime because of who they are, right? And when we think about the impact of trauma, or we think about the previous slide where it is not about being LGBTQ youth, it is the discrimination, it is the trauma, it is the retaliation, it is the oppression that really increases that suicide risk. This makes a lot of sense. Right? When we are looking at youth suicide by the numbers, our LGBTQ youth, almost half have seriously considered suicide. That is shocking to me and deeply, deeply distressing. Almost 40% have made a plan, and almost 30% have tried to die by suicide. When we start exploring our transgender youth and our non-binary youth, this is more than half. Okay? So suicide is a health concern. It is an absolute health concern for our LGBTQ youth. Okay? When we are talking about some of those factors that contribute to that over half, and to that 40%, and to that 30%, right? We can look also to the environments in which our young people are being exposed. And one big one is school, right? Our children spend so much time in school. 1 in 4 LGBTQ plus youth are physically harassed at school. 6 in 10 say they are verbally abused. And many, many, many times when this harassment, abuse, trauma, and violence is reported, our systems are not responding in a way that increases health and safety for our young ones, okay? So these are all contributing factors. Oregon specific, because that's where I work and where I live and I love, and I do my research and my support and services. I just really want you to see a little bit about what's happening in my state, right? In my state, our high schoolers are reporting that since 2015, those who have seriously considered dying by suicide or have tried to die by suicide is continuously on the rise. It's not going down. Even though we're talking more about suicide, we're more aware, right? We're trying to reduce stigma and bias. It's on the rise. This one was really impactful for me. Almost half of the young people surveyed in Oregon in our high schools identified that they could have access to a loaded firearm if they wish to within 24 hours. 24 hours. That really, really surprised me, right? And we think about the high risk of our LGBTQ youth, the things that they are facing, the lack of services and supports for a variety of reasons, and then access to the means to die by suicide. We're just layering the risk. When we talk about Oregon specifically, Oregon has the highest prevalence of mental health challenges among youth and adults in our entire nation. When we look at our LGBTQ youth who were doing reports and helping us understand what's happening to them, they were 4 times as likely to attempt to die by suicide than their straight peers. Now let's throw in some trauma, right? Which we know our LGBTQ youth experience. For those who had physical or sexual abuse in the past year, they were 4 times as more likely to attempt to die by suicide. And as a parent of a LGBTQ young adult who also lives with mental health challenges, right? This last one scares me because our youth who also identify as having disabilities were over 5 times as likely to try to die by suicide. This is a health concern. It is a health concern, okay? So we're going to very quickly look at some general risk factors, and then we're going to look at some specific risk factors. So I am sure that this is not an exhaustive list, right? Well, I know it's not. But some of the things that we really look to as kind of, those red flags, those spidey senses, those, what should we kind of keep that awareness of as families? Are some of these increasing factors that could elevate the risk of suicide? I want to be really, really clear that risk factors do not equal somebody trying to die by suicide, right? But they can increase the risk of our young people trying to die by suicide. Recent loss, right? Chronic health conditions, bullying and cyberbullying, being a part of the LGBTQ community, age, right? Age is a big factor. Okay. A prior attempt is a huge factor. And as we all know, or many of us know in this space, trauma is one of the top risk factors for all challenges when it comes to suicidality challenges, mental health challenges, addiction challenges, right? Trauma is a big one. When we look specifically at our LGBTQ youth, one of the things I really want to impart to our parents, our caregivers, and those who support parents and caregivers is that our LGBTQ young people face dual stigma, right? The stigma and the social and cultural barriers and challenges of being an LGBTQ plus youth, and the stigma of having suicidal thoughts or being suicidal in general, right? Or just having that in their mind as an option. Lack of support, barriers to culturally appropriate mental health and physical health care. This one's really big, especially when we talk about equity, right? When we talk about equity and access, the access to physical healthcare providers, mental health care providers who have that knowledge, those skills, and the abilities to be able to support somebody who faces that dual stigma, who faces that dual discrimination, who faces that dual kind of bias is vitally important. It's vitally important. Isolation is such a huge risk factor for LGBTQ youth, right? Body image, depression, anxiety, and discrimination coming from bullying, violence, and rejection, right? And we're talking rejection from our own families, our neighborhoods, our communities, our peers, our systems, right? That rejection or feeling of not belonging is very, very, very big. So let's talk a little bit about some of those myths and facts. And again, we're going through this curriculum really, really swiftly. And, in the in-person ones, we try to have a lot of time together to kind of have these dialogues with parents, for parents, as parents, right? But let's look at some of the current facts, realities around suicide. So here's some of the myths that parents have been discussing with us that they are still hearing, still believing, still emanating throughout communities and culture, right? That only people with mental health challenges try to die by suicide, right? If you try to die by suicide, you must have a mental health disability, right? And what we know from research and data is that many individuals with mental health challenges are not even affected by suicidal thoughts at all, right? And not all people who try to die by suicide have a mental health challenge, right? Sometimes a trauma or an impulsive thing that happens in life, such as a criminal or legal matter, relationship problems, loss of homes, loss of jobs, loss of income, abuse, trauma, etc., can help increase the risk of that association with suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. Another one that's still really pervasive is talking about suicide, right? And we'll talk about this in the second series when we look at prevention. We know that some of the top protective factors is openly discussing suicide with our whole family, right? But we still see the stigma that if I talk about suicide with my child, it's going to plant it in their head. Now they're going to think about it. Now they're going to want to do it because I put it in their head, right? That's a widespread stigma, right? It's a widespread stigma that keeps us silent and it keeps us really at risk, right? Talking about suicide not only reduces the stigma, but it also allows us to open the door for people to seek help, to have communication, to think about their options, to share their stories, to share their pain, and to be able to find pathways to hope, health, and healing. As somebody said in the chat earlier, recovery is always possible. Recovery is always possible, right? Hope, health, and healing is possible. And so being able to have that dialogue is vitally important. Another one, suicide's not going to touch our family. We have really safe gun use. When I do this in rural and frontier communities who have a wonderful, culture, it's a culture of guns, and it's just part of the families, the communities. One of the things we really talk about is how studies show that just teaching gun safety doesn't reduce the risk of death by firearms, right? We need to make sure that we are validating that many suicide attempts take place during really short-term crisis, right? And that access to the lethal means during that short-term crisis in general can be really problematic, okay? Youth who talk about suicide, I mean, I wish I could see you all and have you raise your hand, right? How many of you ever heard, oh, those youth who just talk about suicide, they're just trying to get attention. They're just, they don't really mean it. They're so dramatic, right? I hear this all the time, not only from families, but from providers, right? And we know this just is not true. Suicidal talk, suicidal actions, suicidal contemplations are signs of deep distress, deep pain, and it is an alert that somebody wants help, okay? All talks of suicide should be taken seriously, whether it's the first time or the 100th time, because you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And I like to shift the lens, right? Talking about suicide, it's not about seeking attention, it's about seeking communication. Our young people are seeking communication because they're trying to tell you they are hurting. And let's just be real, right? Suicide is not a typical reaction, right, to just life stressors, right? It is deep distress, it is deep pain, and it should never be taken lightly when somebody talks about, expresses, or attempts to die by suicide. And also, being good in school or sports or just socially loved by their peers, that's also not going to keep our children safe, right? Suicide doesn't discriminate, right? Sometimes we hear, oh, my kid's doing fine. They're A students. They're on the honor roll. They're in band. They're on the football team. Suicide doesn't discriminate, right? And so this should be a conversation with all of our youth all the time. So where do we go for expert information as parents if all these myths, stigmas, and stuff are still happening? Well, y'all are going to get, I don't know if you've already got the handouts, but if not, you'll get the handouts, I assume, after the session. But it's going to have a lot of these resources, because as parents, caregivers, and forever people who are raising children within the LGBTQ community, we need to go where the content experts are, right? The content experts, like the National Institute of Mental Health, American Association of Suicidology, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, our Indian Health Services, our IHS, our Suicide Awareness Voices in Education. And one of the ones I think that is even more vitally important is our Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is a nonprofit organization that provides that crisis support and intervention, including suicide prevention and intervention for our LGBTQ plus youth, right? And they also advocate for laws, policies, and procedures that help to reduce suicide for our youth, right? Another one, obviously, is going to be our National Suicide Hotline. And this one I really like. It's the text line. I spoke to you that my daughter lives with chronic suicidality, and we can discuss that in the Q&A if anybody has a question. But she really likes this text line where she can text home to 741-741 when she is feeling like she is spiraling or dysregulated. And it is a peer-to-peer. They stay with you, go through the crisis with you. They're strengths-based. And really, it's just been a great asset. And one of the reasons she says she likes it so much is because when she's upset and crying or just in deep distress, it's a lot easier to text than try to talk, right? So this has been a really wonderful resource. For those of you in Oregon, we have the Reach Out Oregon warm line for parents and caregivers. And this is a parent-to-parent warm line where Monday through Friday, noon to 7, parents with any type of concern, challenge, resource need, support need can call and talk to other parents who have that same lived experience, who are able to sit with you, validate, empathize, and hopefully help you navigate what is best for you and your youth. Okay. The last thing I want to say about this before we move forward is that I really want to emphasize that many of these resources and services, they're totally not just for crisis. I like to use them to ask questions and information. And what's the best language when I talk about suicide, and how do I navigate this discussion, or what are some of the things I can do, or what are some of those risk factors, right? You can also call them as a parent, caregiver, forever person for resources and information. Okay. Now let's talk about our youth. So we've talked about why suicide is a top health concern for our LGBTQ plus young people in Oregon, in the nation, and I truly believe in the world, right? We've talked about some of the general risk factors, but then also those risk factors that are specific to our beautiful LGBTQ youth community. We've talked about some of the needs that they have. We've talked about some of the myth and stigma that's still out there and how we can push back on that, and where we as parents, caregivers, forever people, or providers who support parents, caregivers, forever people can get information, content, expert information, and support. Now let's talk about how our youth are communicating. Where are they going to for information? Where are they going to for support? And I want to let you know that this next section, it really culminated from discussions with young people and young adults about how they're talking about suicide, where they're talking about suicide, the methods they're talking about suicide, and really some of those areas that maybe I, as you know, somebody in kind of this adult culture world, right, wouldn't understand, or may not understand, or may see differently. So the first thing I want you to know is social media, right? Social media is absolutely the top area that our young people that we helped that help partner for this curriculum discuss. They're talking about suicide. Everything from Snapchat to Facebook to Instagram to TikTok to, oh my goodness, Twitter. I mean, all over the place. Social media is the big one. And our young people say, if you really want to engage with us about this suicide topic of where we're getting information, where we're sharing information, social media is going to be big. What kind of styles are our young people telling us that they're using? So one of the things I really wanted to dive into is some of the communication styles the young people were utilizing, and how maybe sometimes that can get missed in translation, right? So one of the things we talked about with our panelists, our young people and our young adult panelists, is that there's multiple styles and they're all so individualized. You know, many of our LGBTQ youth say, you know, sometimes I'm just really reflective on this topic. Some are like, I'm silent, and many times that's culture, right? That we don't talk about this. This isn't an appropriate conversation. Many of our youth talked about joking about suicide, right? That sarcasm, that dark humor, that was a big one. Venting, some were open and just kind of had those organic conversations, and others were really questioning and debating the research, the data, and suicide in general. So what I really want to emphasize here before we get into two specific examples that our youth shared with us, that they really wanted us as providers, mental health providers, to know, and as parents and caregivers and forever people to know, is that these are all wonderful. They're all individualized, they're all unique, and each style will kind of bring about its own approach to having an open dialogue as a family about suicide. So let's start with some examples that our young people talked to us about some examples that really might be non-activating for us as providers, parents, caregivers, forever people, and some that might be activating, right? That might kind of make you go, whoa, I don't know about that. Okay. So the first ones I want you to see is how our young people are supporting each other through social media connections, around mental health, behavioral health, and suicide challenges, right? And I want you to know these are all very real examples from real youth and young adults that they wanted to share with us to say, hey, we are talking about this. We're opening the door to this. We're really, you know, especially as LGBTQ youth, we want to break down this stigma and support each other. So this one was from a young person, and as you can see, it says, you are not a burden if you're sad quite often. You are not a burden if you are living with constant anxiety. You are not a burden if you need a lot of reassurance, and you are not a burden if you reach out for help. I love this one. I love this one. Another one a young adult gave to us as a partnership for this curriculum was how in a social media kind of thread, they really started talking to each other about how they can partner together and how they can reduce that silence, right? That silence. And this one was, let's talk about how hard it is to open up to someone about being sad for no reason. Let's talk about how hard it is to explain to your friends and your family that you have this heavy feeling in your chest for what seems like no reason. Let's talk about how hard it is to understand why you're having a panic attack while just walking back home. Ugh. Let's talk about how hard it is to understand your own self and how scary it is to feel like the whole world is falling on your shoulders and you don't know why. And the point that these young people were telling me is like, we want to talk about this. We want to talk about this, right? And open up that communication. This one was my favorite. And it was really this support of young people. And this one was sent by a young adult, an LGBTQ young adult, to somebody going through really, really tough times. And it says, one day you'll tell your story of how you've overcome what you're going through now, and it will become part of someone else's survival guide. This one's so beautiful, touches my heart so much, because our LGBTQ youth are so resilient. They're so strong. They're so everything, right? And sometimes that lived experience, that lived journey of going through some really tough stuff, including the tough stuff of suicidality, becomes the stories that help the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, and becomes part of their survival guide, right? I think about what Christina said earlier. You know, one of the reasons I do this is because my journey was really freaking hard. But I'm hoping something from that with my daughter and I will help other families on the pathway of health and healing, other providers to create more pathways to health and healing. So now let's look at some that might be a little scratchy for some of us who are here in a parent, caregiver, or maybe provider role. So we're going to go through two, and then the last one we'll do an activation warning before it came. So these are also real examples that young people and young adults shared with us about how they're communicating about suicide. So this one was one that they were putting up around major depression, right? And it was like, oh, at first I was like, oh, life is meaningless. And then I'm like, yeah, life is meaningless, right? This dark humor, this dark sarcasm around depression and really being in those dark places of not feeling there's hope for anything or meaning. The next one was given to us by a young adult who lives with depression and anxiety challenges, right? And also suicidality challenges. And as you can see here, it says, you know, my friends are trying to check up on me. And then it has what they said was them speeding down a dark path of depression, basically ignoring everybody else and just following their mental health. Okay. This one really was interesting. And at first, you know, I was like, this isn't funny. But it was how they were telling us they were communicating, right? How are we tackling this big topic? So before I do the next one, I want to give an activation warning for those of you who might have your life touched by suicide, deaths by suicide, especially around deaths by suicide via asphyxiation. The next slide has a noose in it. And if this is something that you might find disturbing, I encourage you to please just look away, lower the screen, whatever it is that will help you kind of just stay balanced and comfortable and as safe as possible. But I want to give that activation warning that the next one was a little disturbing when I had this discussion with young people. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to that one. And this one was sent to us from someone who lives with suicide challenges. And it says 4 things I'm always thinking about as a young person: chicken nuggets, cheesy fries, pizza, and basically dying. So food and death. As a young person, I'm thinking about food and death. And again, I really want you to think about, these are real communications that real youth are having about really tough topics. And I hope that you can meditate. Let's just for a second meditate. What were your thoughts and feelings around some of these examples? Did you see any strengths in them? Were there any cultural considerations to some of these forms of communications that you can connect to? Because that was the hardest piece for me. You know, as a parent of a LGBTQ youth who lives with chronic suicidality, when I saw especially those last 3, I was upset. And I was like, this isn't funny. Suicide's not a joke. And almost all of the young people we talked to said, you need to understand how we are tackling this topic as a youth community, as a young adult community. And sometimes for us, it's about having to have that dark humor because it's how we're coping. It is how we are continuing this discussion. It is how I'm making it through the day. It's how I'm connecting with my peers. And for me, you know, in my provider world and my parent world and my adult world, I'm like, no, that's not okay. But for them, it's like, it's how we're handling this. And you have to understand our culture and our communication styles and our social media and our needs for this connection. And I had to have some humility there. Right? And for me, again, the talking is a strength, the breaking of stigma is a strength. And really think about what are you seeing in your communities. So the last thing we're going to talk about before we wrap up is, again, just how suicide is a whole family issue. I mean, you know, this is suicide awareness for families raising LGBTQ youth, right? We need to be aware of those risk factors. We need to be aware of those extra barriers. We need to be aware of the discrimination. We need to be aware of the pathways to support and healing. We need to be aware of where do we get expert information and break down myth and stigma. We need to be aware of how our youth are communicating. And second, lastly, we need to be aware of how we as a family can support each other as a family, holistically as a family, in suicide communication, prevention, and health and wellness, right? Because it's a whole family issue. One of the top things is talking about suicide together, right? And it's about that family communication around suicide. And I want to validate right now, right here, this is not typical. This is not the norm for many families and not comfortable for many families, especially for those of you who have cultural considerations where this is not a topic. Right? It's taboo. It's not something we discuss together. But one of the things I really want us to acknowledge, hopefully, is that talking about suicide reduces suicide risk. Opening doors to communications opens doors to sharing feelings, which opens doors to sharing thoughts of suicide, which opens doors to getting health support and healing. Talking about it is a protective factor. And I really want y'all to take a look at this continuum here real quick and just start thinking about, you know, those you support or maybe your own family. And we're going to do a quick poll, but really this continuum of how we talk about suicide with our kids, our partners, our siblings, our grandparents, our aunties, our uncles, our elders, right? Is going to be different for all of you. So on the far end is like, hey, no. Our personal and family culture, we do not align with talking about suicide at all. The next, you know, as we move down the continuum is about being curious about youth suicide, but I'm not quite yet comfortable talking about it. Down the continuum more, I'm comfortable learning about it, and I'm comfortable talking to few select people about suicide. And the last one is really around, hey, suicide's an open topic in my family, and we feel very, very comfortable bringing it up and asking questions. I'll tell you, I'm now in that category, but it took me many years to get there, right? I was scared, and I thought I was going to put it in my daughter's head, and I thought I was contributing to the mental health, and I thought if there was all this, right, just hush, I had to be hush. And over time and over experience and over the journey, one of the things, at least for my child, that I realized was talking about it took the lid off the boiling pot, and she was able to release the steam. And having my whole family comfortable talking about suicide reduced the unintentional message that we should be silent and deal with this alone in isolation, which many of our LGBTQ youth are dealing alone in isolation with these thoughts, feelings, barriers, and choices, right? So let's put up a poll here real quick. And I'm just curious where you all feel like you're at on this continuum. And again, these are anonymous, so nobody can see it. Nobody's going to know who picked what. But it's like, where do you feel for you as a parent, a caregiver, or just a community member, not just a, but as a community member, or just, where are you at on this comfort? Oh, thank you, everybody. Great. We've got like about half done, about half. Give you just a little bit time here, maybe 30, 60 seconds. All right. I know not everybody's probably had a chance to do the poll, but let's just go ahead and close it out and let's look. Wow, this is fabulous. Thank you all so much for taking the time to do this. I really want to validate and acknowledge those who aligned with, our culture. We don't talk about suicide. This isn't something that's open, and I'm curious, but I'm not yet ready. Many of you are comfortable learning, but have few select people. And wow, 32% is an open topic in your family, and we are very comfortable. That warms my heart. That warms my heart. Great. Thank you, everybody, for taking a moment to really just kind of reflect on where you are today and maybe where you want to be if you ever start meditating on moving down that continuum of suicide talks as a family. So let me see. There we go. We're going to kind of finish up with just putting the bow on this whole family thing. And if y'all come to the prevention, we dive deeper into how can we as families raising LGBTQ youth really build up those protective factors to increase resiliency as a whole family, because we know that suicide does not just touch the sole individual lives of our LGBTQ youth who are thinking about dying by suicide, right? Or trying to die by suicide. It is a whole family issue. And sometimes in mental health, behavioral health, kind of the system world, there's a hyper focus on the youth, who might have suicide challenges. And that is good, that is needed. But when we're talking about awareness and prevention, we really need this to be a whole family issue, because mental health or suicidality or behavioral health or any of those challenges really is a whole family ripple. It has a whole family ripple effect. So that whole family communication and building of protective factors is going to be so important. So just to kind of add a little bit of information here, that not only is communication as a whole family going to be a protective factor, right? And we're going to dive more into these in our next session. Certain factors can help build that resiliency and increase suicide prevention for our LGBTQ youth we are raising. Some of those are going to be, like we said, the community and school supports. We talked about the school environment being one of those big areas of concern. strong, positive relationships with families and friends, being able to attend or have membership within your community, right? Like gay straight alliances, the LGBTQ community organizations. Some of us, like in Oregon, we have like, I think, the P flag for parents, Rainbow Youth, right? If we have accessible, let me emphasize that, accessible and non-discriminatory mental and physical health care. And why do I emphasize accessible? Kind of small truth bomb moment here. Having insurance, especially for many of our marginalized communities, so I'm just going to speak to that right now, including our LGBTQ youth communities, our communities of poverty, communities of color. Just having an insurance card means squat if you cannot use it, if it is not accessible. So having the ability to have supports and services in your community and the financial ability to use it, the physical ability to use it, right? The accessible access is the key term here for our LGBTQ youth and all of us, right? On pathways to health and healing. When our school districts have integrated policies and programs to ensure LGBTQ plus students feel safe, increase safety, reduce bias and stigma, reduce bullying, reduce violence, reduce discrimination, right? This is huge. Some of the other areas that help to reduce suicidality and that risk factor is really sometimes those cultural norms for families that discuss but discourage suicide as the option, right? The only option. Having positive role models, especially role models within our LGBTQ community, right? And having our basic needs met. Having our basic needs met, food, shelter, housing, access to medical, physical, mental health care, access to education, access to clothing, transportation, daycare, all those things that help us get through life, right? These are going to be many areas we're going to focus on. What does it look like from a holistic perspective? Well, from a holistic perspective, it's the whole freaking family, right? It's the whole family. When it comes to, and I learned this so much in my own journey with my daughter and her suicide challenges. It is about the whole family and all of our life domains. These are the 10 life domains. And really, when it comes to suicide awareness and that pathway to suicide prevention, looking at all of these life domains as areas to find strengths and areas to build strengths helps us as whole families to be resilient if and when these possible crisis challenges may come, right? Do I have a home and a place to live? Do I have financial needs met? How is our social life domain? What about our cultural life domain, our health, our legal? Are there needs anywhere for the whole family as a whole family? Because the stronger the whole family, the more we work together for suicide prevention, intervention, health and wellness, and recovery, okay? So when I'm talking about awareness in all life domains, this is really that integration of mindfulness around how when families don't have a home and a place to live, that can increase anxiety, that can increase depression, that can increase trauma, that can increase suicidality. When we are socially isolated, that can increase anxiety, that can increase depression, that can increase feeling of a burden, that can increase hopelessness, that can increase suicidality, okay? Financial insecurity, same thing. Legal challenges, same thing. Cultural disconnection, same thing. Spiritual disconnection, same thing. And so in many of my other classes, we really focus for quite a bit of time on this section. We don't have time today to do that, But hopefully, if y'all come back to the community learning sessions, or for those of you signed up for the community learning sessions, we're going to really talk about how, as a community, we support these four families to build within families to help them be as resilient as possible if and when challenges come, right? Because when our needs are not met in all of the life domains, it affects everybody in the family, including those who are thinking about suicide, okay? Including those who are thinking about suicide. All right, wrapping up. Remember some best practices, my friends. Talking out loud about suicidal feelings, thoughts, and plans with confidence makes you a safe place to land for your LGBTQ youth who might be struggling with these thoughts, ideas, or plans. Right? I always say this is the only time in any of my educational series or any of my trainings that I say this is the one time where I say fake it till you make it. Right? Because when I started talking about and opening up dialogue about suicide with my youth, I was scared to death. I mean, that was terrible. I was very scared. My heart's pounding, my body's shaking, I'm sweaty, right? But I had to really pull it together and be that safe place to land, because what she was experiencing, she needed someone there that she knew would be there even when the topic was real tough, right? A safe place to land. Please know your local resources. As parents, caregivers, forever people, and providers who support parents, caregivers, and forever people of LGBTQ plus youth, where are your resources? Your basic needs resources, your life domain resources, and more specifically, your culturally appropriate mental health, physical health, behavioral health, and addictions service supports and providers who have culturally relevant supports for the LGBTQ plus community, right? Where do you go for reliable information? Look to your handouts, have those deeper discussions, really focus on what are those red flags and those awareness tools, right? Those risk factors, because that helps us to keep kind of our spidey senses up if and when we need to have those discussions or those interventions. And at the very last thing I want to say to y'all before we wrap up is self-care, self-care, self-care. I know for many of you in the, here we talk about self-care all the time, and it's on Time magazine, but especially for us families who are raising children with depression, anxiety, maybe suicidality challenges, remaining balanced and making a habit of balance helps us to stay balanced to the best of our ability if and when these challenges come up. Okay, so that self-care is the key. Good daily practices that help keep us in balance is the key to being comfortable when and if some of these crisis situations may come up. Okay, some of the handouts you'll get later is some 50 self-care ideas, a handout on self-care for families, but really that whole family, that whole holistic self-care for all of us is going to help us to have that body reaction of increased balance when it's time to face and navigate some really tough stuff. Okay. So I want to thank you all very, very much for being here today. It was absolutely my honor to have this moment with you. I look forward to our prevention class and our community learning sessions. Thank you for caring about this topic. Thank you for being a part of this topic. Thank you for caring about our LGBTQ youth plus community, their health, their wellness, and their journey and their future. So may you all be blessed. Go forth, do good works, and love on people. Thank you again.
Thank you, Shawna. I'm really glad that you're coming back because there are a lot of questions, and can we try to get through some of them?
Yes.
Let's see what we can do. I know it's a lot of information, and thank you everybody for connecting in the chat. I think that you covered this. Are there one or two major reasons as to why youth who identify as LGBTQ become or are suicidal? I think you covered that, but I want to, if there's other things, Marianne, that we'll just say that one's done. If you have another question, please just repost. Another question is the curriculum you shared deemed evidence-based, and that's a tricky question because I think we do support evidence-based practices in our network and in our center. However, we know that clangs for a lot of people because who has been part of the evidence and the research, it's not always very inclusive. So we certainly feel like evidence-based practices have their place. We don't only support things that have that particular label, but wanted to ask if that was something that you were familiar with, or how, if this has been just more out in the world and practiced with families, or,
You ask it again.
Like
I'm sorry.
I rambled on. Nope, I rambled on. Is the curriculum you referenced, I think you're talking about our trainings that you do at OFSN, is it deemed evidence-based or in process or anything like that?
The curriculum. I think, so let me just speak to this particular training. This particular training is really two areas that got merged together, right? And that is research that is evidence-based combined with practices that show evidence.
Yeah.
Right. So it's evidence-based practices combined with practices that show evidence. And what does that mean to me? That means I always want to have a foundation of research data, right? Really, what is the current evidence out there around youth suicidality, LGBTQ youth suicidality, mental health, et cetera, in general. And then the other side of that is really those practices that show evidence from those of us who live this life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, providers who support people who live this life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I think that's particularly important around the awareness curriculum, right? Because, I mean, I couldn't really say, oh, awareness is evidence-based. Awareness is just good,
Right. Yeah. There's some just wisdom that lives in the world that we don't need a paper to tell us. However, there are places for all of these kinds of practices. And I think, especially, I hear people talk about what are practices that are really coming from the community, right? Nothing about us without us and that sort of thing. And so maybe there aren't researchers, putting data to these practices, but we know, that they're living, breathing things that are really helpful. So appreciate that comment. How about this is a tricky question, I think, for me, because people talk a lot about ACEs and the ACE study. And if you want to really research what the ACE study was and how it's also used now, I think it's a little controversial, only because it wasn't meant to be a predictor. This was a retrospective study, so please read about it. But, the question, I think it's so on people's minds is there anything about ACEs, LGBTQ plus youth, and how this might relate to suicide risk factors? Don't know if you have anything to say about it, but I just wanted to ask. Great.
I do. Yeah.
Great.
No, the ACEs is a lot of some other curriculum that I teach. So I totally agree, Christina, and I'll try to make this short. It's not, there's many flaws within the original ACEs study, right? And we know so much more now as it's been replicated and gone forward. However, it was a monumental public health awareness raising moment. And I think that's so amazing. And it really started that conversation around trauma and negative health outcomes, even up into death, too early, up to 20 years too early. So in specific to that question, what I would really encourage you all to check out is the additional work that was done by the RISE Center, RYSE, in 2015 that contributed to the ACEs. Because basically what the RISE Center did is they got together, youth, adults, educational, researchers, and they said, yeah, this is all good. However, trauma doesn't start at birth. What you are born into also contributes to the propensity of trauma from birth to 18, the amount of trauma, the risk of trauma. And two areas that the RISE Center really looked at was, what is the historical and cultural context you're going to be born into, like historical trauma, generational trauma, communities? And then the second is, what is the social and cultural context that you're going to be born into? So very, very quickly, let me give you an example. So if you are born an LGBTQ, plus person, you are already born into a social and cultural context that puts you at higher risk for violence, trauma, homicide, assaults, discrimination, inequitable access to things. Same as, being a woman, being born into social cultural context of lack of power and privilege, lack of, certain things that put you at higher risk for sexual assault, physical assault, domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. So they really, my son is, not my son, I'm sorry. Some of my family members are First Nations. Just being born into tribal communities, right, puts you at higher levels of risk for historical trauma, generational trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely, the ACEs, when you look at some of the additions over the years to that, really speak to that LGBTQ youth component socially and culturally, historically and generationally, and how that contributes to negative health outcomes, including suicide.
No, and that's so helpful to have those other pieces, because I think knowing, health disparities are real. We realize that, health outcomes and all of those things. So I think, please hear me. It was monumental. I agree.
Yeah.
I'm just not always clear if we understand the connection of that original study and then versus what you're talking about, which is sort of bringing it to the present. And we talked about it in a recent webinar too, about just who was in the ACE study, not very diverse. It was for a different purpose, and they discovered all these other things. So it's really fascinating stuff, but we know that health outcomes are impacted by, your zip code, your hair color, your, all those things that you mentioned and other people have mentioned. So thank you for talking about that. This might be a little bit big to cover, but I know this was important. Religion, suicide, people who are, queer, trans, LGBTQ plus, the church settings, community settings, is very difficult, so, and yet we realize, and this person talks about a high demand religion in Utah, and it's really difficult. It seems like too many religions are, make this such a huge conflict. So I don't know if you can possibly get to some of this content. I'm sure it's come up in all the trainings and work you've done.
Yeah.
How can we better help institutions better support folks who are experiencing these crises?
I'm going to have a very vulnerable moment here and just kind of be real, or as Brene Brown says, I'm going to be brave and dare greatly. And really just decline this one. And the reason is I have a really hard time separating my personal feelings and not being activated around this. Mm-hmm. However, with that being said, I want to really express that cultural, spiritual components that isolate off LGBTQ plus youth, or even give the perception that they are different, bad, broken, or are not acceptable as who they are, absolutely contributes to suicide, period. Mm-hmm. It is empirical, right? It is absolutely true, right? It is that I don't belong, I'm different, I'm broken. And so I encourage you all to really look into some of those things. I will say in the prevention class, some of the handouts that I'm going to give out is, if you come from a spiritual culture that might have some maybe non-affirming beliefs, what can you do though still for suicide prevention? And if you don't come from a spiritual culture that has those non-affirming beliefs, what can you do, right? So we're going to tackle that in a loving, open, organic conversation way. But I really try very hard not to shame or blame cultures, or not to get into some of those things. But at the same time, especially as a parent of a child who's part of the LGBTQ community, I will validate that certain spiritual communities do contribute to youth suicide within our community.
Well, I appreciate this is a touchy area. And I think I wouldn't even hazard to try and answer this other than to say the bit that I have seen and read or watched, documentaries. It seems like when it becomes personal, people discover that the doctrine doesn't fit reality when it's someone they know, it's someone they love, it's someone they care about, because it's so easy to be in that impersonal state or these generalization states. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at anything, any place, community, religion, nothing. But yeah, when people are left out, as you said, that is a contributor to, non-healthy, living, generally, especially when, in many other communities, being a community is so much more valued than a lot of times it can feel like in our society. So to be kind of left out or ostracized deliberately, it's not going to help if you're already feeling that way. So thank you for trying to tactfully answer this very complex question.
And if I can just, Christina, if it's okay, I just want to add on to, I think sometimes we do have, and for good reason, many of these spiritual, cultural conversations, but I really want to remind people that our mental health environment can be isolating and segregating for LGBTQ.
Absolutely.
Our schools can be segregating and isolating for our LGBTQ youth, right? Our social places are, so it's really broad. It is anything that makes it, if my daughter was sitting right next to me and she's a queer woman, and any institution in any place or any social environment or any educational environment says that I have more value than my daughter, that in and of itself contributes to suicide and is wrong, regardless of wherever it is.
Yeah. No, I know people are sharing stuff in the chat as well. This is, these are very personal issues a lot of times, and people have had to suffer through a lot of things. I'm going to try and get through these last couple of questions in the next 2 minutes. Do you have, and if it needs to wait till the next session, we can, and we will summarize these questions and get answers in a tip sheet. So if we don't get a full answer today, how can you, or do you recommend talking about suicide with young children so they can become comfortable talking about it as they get older? Great
question. And I think this actually came up last summer too, when we all did a partnership. I love that question. So I'm going to try to make this short. So number one, we have to think about the language appropriateness for young children, right? Like I have grandbabies that are 5 and 7, right? And we have to think about the developmental capacity, their own kind of protective and resiliency factors. So here's kind of advice by Shawna, I guess, from the work with youth and families for 16 years and my own work with my own family. I don't go in feet first into the swimming pool, right? I'm not going to go to my 7-year-old, be like, are you thinking about suicide? He's going to be like, what the heck is suicide, right? But what we start doing is having those conversations with young people in a way that starts to make them build trust, attachment, and relationships with us as safe people to come to with tough conversations. And so with the youth and families that I work with, as well as, and who happen to be youth that are, we're still kind of walking that journey, unsure if they're going to be part of the LGBTQ community, but starting to open that space to what brings you joy, what makes you sad, what is this, what is that? Let me give you, if it's okay, very quickly, one example. A young person in my life, very young person in my life, really loves makeup. And we were going to go to the park the other day, and he was like, oh, I've got to take my lipstick off. And we were like, why? He's like, well, because people said I can't wear lipstick because I'm a boy and I can't do this. And really what that was it is an open opportunity to start having conversations about what hurts your heart, what makes you sad, how do you feel about you, what brings you joy? Because once we start having those conversations, youth know what makes them happy and what doesn't at 5 or 3, and we can start having those. I encourage art, but really, I encourage any type of dialogue that lets children identify and articulate their feelings and start setting the foundation for you being a safe place to land.
Well, that is really helpful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I promise you that's why when you put them in the Q&A box, we get a report from Zoom that we can put into a document that we share with Shawna and have her write out some answers. You'll get notified when the recording and all the slides and all of these questions are shared. So I just want to, I want to go through a couple last slides, but I just want to say thank you, Shawna. This has clearly been so crucial. I want to thank everybody for being here, for sharing your own stories during this. We knew this would be powerful and likely very personal, but we really, really, really appreciate your time, and I'm really glad you're coming back. So thank you. Your feedback is important. Again, if you didn't hear me say the personal code, if it's super weird and seems really invasive, just put whatever letters and numbers you want. We just want your feedback. That's the important part. We do have the next session with Shawna coming up in a couple of weeks, 2 weeks from today, in fact. And then there's also additional within the whole network. There's a lot of suicide and prevention and other kind of topics. We also have a 2-part equity series coming up this month. So just wanted to share about that. But other than that, please let us know if you, want to get our newsletter. You can sign up, look at our website, use QR code, all the fun things. We are really happy to connect with you all. And sorry, we're a minute over, but thank you, Shawna. Thank you, Gabrielle, for working so hard in the background. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Till next time.